we're going to talk about contentious politics or political violence, largely talking about domestic issues. So I'm sure all of you have taken international relations courses where you have to talk about politics between states and violence that happens between states. But today we're going to talk about interior conflict and political violence. So what are we talking about when we say political violence or contentious politics? So let's go back to, remember when we talked about the social contract and this idea that people are going to give up some of their private use of violence in favor of the public use of violence, or the state going to protect them instead. But that doesn't mean that violence just disappears. So violence can obviously happen between states, like we said in international relations, or it can happen from people within the state, either the state itself perpetrating unjust violence, or from the people within the state perpetrating violence. So we would define political violence as any violence that's politically motivated, obviously, and outside of the state's control. So we're focusing largely on not the kind of violence that you've given up your right to use violence so that the state can use violence, not that kind of violence. We're talking about when it's outside of the state's control. It's important also to remember that it is political, specifically political. So you're trying to fulfill a political objective through force. So it's not just crime or violence for no particular reason, and it's not the same as war. So that's kind of the parameters of what we're going to be talking about in comparative politics as opposed to what we might talk about in international relations. So why use violence as a political tool? So violence is used by certain actors within a state as a political tool, just like any other form of political not just like any other form of political activism. It's quite different, but as a form of political activism. So why do that? So we say that there's probably three reasons. The first is institutional. So we haven't actually talked that much about institutions. For a comparative politics course, you would think we would talk a little bit more about institutions. But anyway, institutions are essentially at its basic level, we understand that to be a self-perpetuating organization or some sort of pattern of activity that's valued and that is going to shape human activities. So it can be any variety of institutions, so a certain regime, a certain economic institution like capitalism, a certain culture, a certain religion. Any of these sorts of institutions can either constrain or enable violence. So an example of this would be, remember we talked about The Perils of Presidentialism, and we said, well, presidentialism is a regime that is more prone to political violence because when there's a concentration of power in an executive authority, it's less likely that there's any sort of opportunity for power sharing. And so the oppositions, and quite frankly, those in power too, are going to resort to violence in order to keep their political power. So presidentialism is an institution, we know that, and that's an institution that has been demonstrated to have high rates of political violence in some literature. So there can be institutional reasons why something's just prone to using political violence as a political tool. Ideational is just what it sounds, so it's using political violence as a tool based on ideas. So for example, terrorism in the form of suicide bombers is focusing on this idea of self-sacrifice for religious glory, for example. In addition to religious ideas, like in this particular jihadist terrorist example, for example, nationalism can also be an idea that can be used to legitimate political violence. So, we've seen this in Canada with the FLQ, in Quebec using violence, letter bombings, kidnappings to promote a national cause. Or a nationalist cause for Quebec. So you might use political violence as a tool because of specific ideas. And then the final is individual. So there might be personal motivations driving violence as an expression of desperation. So you often say, the revolutions happen out of despair. And we're going to talk more about revolutions in a minute. That, you have nothing to eat, and if people are really hungry, they're going to do whatever it takes to get food, including use violence. So those are kind of the three reasons that we say why people might use, actors might use violence as a political tool. Now, of course, rarely does one of these particular reasons live in a vacuum. Obviously, you're going to have individuals with ideas working in specific institutions. So again, even though we kind of categorize it into three, usually they're all going to be working together, or at least some of them are going to be working together. So we're going to talk today about two particular uses of violence as a political tool. We're going to talk about revolutions and terrorism. So let's start with revolution. So revolution, essentially the definition of that is that it's a public seizure of the state to overthrow the existing government and regime. So there's a few different elements that have to be present for it to really be a revolution. So the first is public participation. So the public has to be seizing control of the state in some way. So for example, a coup d'etat where the military is overthrowing the existing government, please never do that. That's not public participation. That's the military overthrowing or the regime in favor of a military government or in favor of a different leader. So a coup d'etat is not a revolution. So there needs to be public participation in it. There needs to be seizure of the control of the state. So this is very different from, say, ethnic conflicts where a group is trying to get some sort of local control. That's less of a revolution as, again, a nationalist movement or a secessionist movement. You're trying to get control of the entire state in a revolution. And then the final thing is that the objective is not just the removal of those who are in power, but fully just removing the regime itself. So it's not about just replacing one particular king in power with another particular king. Instead, it's about removing the entire regime and replacing it with an entirely different regime. So public participation has to be seizing control of the state, and then the objective needs to be removing the regime itself. Do revolutions need to be violent? That's one question. We often think about revolutions. We think of very violent conflicts. We think of the French Revolution, the American Revolution. When they aren't violent, we tend to talk about them being more political transitions. So for example, in 1939, some could argue that the fall of communism was a revolution. There's a very good argument for that, but we tend to, when we talk about it, we say it was more of a political transition because there wasn't the use of violence. Same thing, South Africa, the fall of apartheid happened without violence. Yes, revolutions can be nonviolent, but we tend to use different terminology when the use of violence isn't present. Do revolutions always succeed? Obviously not. Some get quashed very quickly. Others, you might be trying to put in place a democratic government, and what you end up with is just another authoritarian regime. In fact, this happens quite often. An example could be Cuba, where you're trying to rise up to bring a democratic regime, and what you end up with is another authoritarian regime. So I guess the last question that we're really interested in is, well, what causes revolutions? And scholars of comparative politics have been debating this question at length for decades and decades. So we're going to look at a couple of theories of why a revolution happens. Why does it happen when it happens? Why did the French Revolution come at the time it did? Same with the American Revolution. Same with more recent revolutions that we've seen. So one theory is the relative deprivation model. So essentially this idea is that a revolution is going to happen when there's a gap between public expectations and the reality. And so oftentimes we use the example of, French people are getting really hungry before the revolution. There's bread riots, and that was what really led into revolution, right? People will do a lot of things when they're hungry. There's also the movement of ideas happening. And so there's this expectation of, we're starting to have these Enlightenment ideas that we want to fulfill into reality in our state. So it can be the relative deprivation in terms of like actual deprivation and, I don't have enough to eat. I don't have stability. And it can also be that certain ideas are starting to come to the fore and you're not being fulfilled through your current government to be able to express these ideas. So as I mentioned in the last video, I've been going down the Iranian rabbit hole these days, watching lots of videos and reading stuff on the Iranian Revolution, the impact in the Middle East. So that's going to be our example for the day of the relative deprivation model. So this is a crash course video. I've probably mentioned before, I love using these videos. I love just watching them for fun. And so the 1979 Iranian Revolution, one could make a very good case, and I think this video does actually pull that out really well, that the population was modernizing and had new expectations. So it wasn't necessarily that they weren't being fed, even though, yeah, there were economic issues as well, but they had these expectations of freedom that weren't being met by the current regime, and therefore they rose up. to replace that regime. You can see the three characteristics that we talked about. So there's public participation, seizing control of the state itself, and the objection is not just removing those in powers, but completely removing the regime and transforming it. So this is an example, I would say, of a relative deprivation model being a good explainer for a revolution. So pause this video, go take a look at the Iranian Revolution, and come back and we'll take a look at another model we can use. All right, so another model that we talk about when we talk about revolution is Theda Skocpol's States and Social Revolutions. So this is a really key work, a key book in comparative politics. What she does is she does an analysis of France, Russia, and China. So three key case studies as a way of understanding just beyond a political revolution to what's a real social revolution. So not just changing the government, but she sees social transformation as key. So essentially she says, these previous models that we had were all very rational. People saying, I am not being fulfilled, therefore I am going to rise up, or I am not being fed, therefore I am going to rise up. But the problem is that there's all sorts of structural forces that are going to either allow or prevent a revolutionary situation. And so she really tries to focus on the structural conditions. And she says that, like I mentioned earlier, that there needs what's really interesting is when there's a social revolution. So it's both a change in state institutions, so a political revolution, but also a change in structures. So she gives the example of the American Revolution was a political revolution. It didn't change the entire social structures, whereas the Chinese Revolution was very much a social revolution in the sense that, yes, the institutions changed, but also the entire social order changed. So she says, two things need to happen for this sort of big social revolution to come about. First, there needs to be some sort of crisis of state. So she calls it a crisis of state. So essentially, this can be international factors, it can be economic issues, security issues, some sort of crisis prevented to the state, and the state can't actually respond to it effectively. And so elites are going to decide, okay, we don't really know what to do about this, and this creates the precursor to a revolutionary situation. So there's some sort of external shock that happens to the system. Now, at the same time, there's going to be she's kind of a bit of a Marxist theorist. So she says, class dominance is also going to determine then which group is going to rise up and take advantage of this situation. So there's lots of Marxist thought in here. And she essentially says you're going to get this crisis of state, and then because of the different patterns of class dominance within each state, one of these groups is going to rise up to taking control of the situation. And that's really what she says, then that's when you're going to get this full social transformation, not just a political transformation, is when you bring this class understanding and the structural understanding together into one theory. So she looks at, again, the cases of France, Russia, and China as examples of where this has been at work. So the other form of political violence that I want to talk about in this particular video is terrorism. So I understand that there is a full course, multiple, I think, full courses here at RMC about terrorism. So, I'm sure some of you have taken this course and it's probably going to be a big just refresh. But if you haven't heard about terrorism before, I don't know where you've been, but here's kind of the gist of it. So essentially, the key thing about terrorism is that it's violence by non-state actors against civilians in order to achieve a political goal. So the important thing there is that it's non-state actors. Actually, I think I have a chart here. Yeah. So we'll go back to the political goals in a second, but we'll just talk about non-state actors. So this is a nice chart. It comes from, I didn't cite it, but it comes from O'Neill's Comparative Politics textbook, and I just reproduced it here. Essentially, you can tell what kind of political violence you're dealing with and whether you're dealing with terrorism or not based on knowing who the actor is and who the target of their actions is. So if it's a non-state actor and the target is civilians, you got terrorism. If it's a non-state actor and the target is the state, you have something more like guerrilla warfare. They also say, okay, well, if the actor perpetrating the violence is the state, on state, we know it's war, and then state on civilians, we get human rights violations, war crimes, and And we're going to talk more about these sorts of human rights violations of a state perpetrating it against civilians in class with our guest lecturer this week. Anyway, so back to this idea of violence by non-state actors, and it has to be against civilians in order to achieve a political goal. So the key thing here is political goal. It can't just be violence for the sake of it. That's crime. It has to be to achieve a specific goal. So I guess the $10 million question, of course, is, well, then what causes terrorism? Who knows? There's so many different explanations for it. Is it economic inequality, marginalization, lower education levels among people make them resort to terrorism, certain political institutions that people feel like they can't really participate in, so they resort to other sorts of violent means to participate in politics through terrorism. There's really just a wealth of explanations for why we might get to see this sort of terrorism emerge, but some of the common threads include this fact that there are marginalized populations who feel like they can't participate in politics in a different sort of way and resort therefore to violence. There's also we put right here state-sponsored terrorism. The idea that a state gets individuals to do the action for them in a way that they can't, whether it's because of international constraints, because public image issues. So an example of that might be both India and Pakistan. The ongoing conflict in Kashmir. Some terrorist people saying that some of these terrorists that exist there are being trained by the government, especially the Pakistan's government has been called out for training some of the terrorists there. So this also it moves in between. It's kind of both a state actor and a non-state actor targeting civilians in state-sponsored terrorism. So we're going to just pause and go over for a second to Our World in Data, which I'm a huge fan of. So Our World in Data has a great page on terrorism. So let's just look at some of the trends that have existed. So where in the world have we seen the largest amounts of terrorist attacks? It's largely concentrated in Asia. You can see the darker the color, the greater number of terrorist attacks. And we can click on some of these countries and see what's been going on there. So this, for example, is Iraq, and you can see 2014 ISIS or ISIL or Daesh or whatever you want to call it, it is really gaining power, and you can see just a huge spike in the number of terrorist incidents in Iraq. And it's not surprising that you get this spike around here, and then it tapers off a little bit. Somalia also, you can see a spike in 2014. Again, it's a failed state, so they've been having lots of issues, but you can see the increase in terrorism around the 2014 time. India, Pakistan, this area has, because of the conflicts in border regions, India's had a lot of different challenges with terrorism, either in Kashmir, in East Central or South Central India. There's been many conflicts there that certain non-state actors have resorted to terrorism. And then Philippines has a lot of issues as well currently with non-state actors, especially secessionist movements using terrorism as a political tool. So you can even see, if we move down here, you can see globally even around 2014 the spike, again largely attributed to a growth in ISIS and extremism in the Middle East and other places. So you can see the big jump in Iraq, Syria. Just let's move down here. There's one more. Yeah, okay. So the broader perspective. So one thing though that we need to remember though is that terrorism actually kills many less people than we often think. You guys might have a better sense of this than a lot of the general population does, but we often forget that terrorism is one of the smaller or lower causes of death. And we're going to see that in just a second in a video that I wanted to show you. So does terrorism work? Some people say yes. Here's the example on that. Some people say that there's research that demonstrates that it actually does cause its aims. If its aims are to seek to get into these political negotiations, if it seeks to publicize certain political aims, it can do that. Others say, actually, when you look statistically in the grand scheme of things, that it's actually not a rational behavior. It's not really a good idea because it's not actually going to achieve its objectives, and it's actually going to fail over time. So there's scholarly debate about whether terrorism is a good strategy. And again, I'd suggest take the whole course if you're really interested in that. So let's head back to here. So we talked about that. Yes, this is the last thing I wanted to talk about a little bit. I'm somebody who's really interested in how people interpret political information, how people understand things. And I came across when I was doing, I was actually looking for something completely different. I was going to give you an example of what's going on in Kashmir and what has gone on in Kashmir between India and Pakistan. And I came across this really cool video about what your brain is doing in terrorism. Essentially the idea of how we react to terrorism and how we see it on the news actually helps it fulfill some of its aims. So I'm going to send you over to that video as the last piece of today's video lecture. So once you've seen that, you're welcome to close up and do the quiz.